Okay, hello everyone and welcome to the 2022 edition of Capital Literature. Today's talk, What Role Can Literary Writers Play in Combating the Climate Crisis by Emily Raboteau. I'm Milena Deleva, the chair of the board of the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation. And for the visually impaired people, I'm a female with brown hair, shoulder length, wearing a black shirt and long multicolor earrings crafted by the Amazonian tribe, Yawanahua in Brazil. My accent comes from Bulgaria, and I'm joining the event today from the Lenape land, nowadays Manhattan. For those of you who are new to our work, the Foundation creates literary bridges between the Anglosphere and Bulgaria, and cross exposures like the one today. Capital Literature is one of our international programs that normally takes place in Sofia. And this year's edition, with a focus on climate change, has been planned and rescheduled several times already, including for reasons that have to do with climate change, along with other disruptions. So special thanks to Violeta Radkova and Victoria Kostova for bringing this to fruition this year, and all other sponsors of the event, which Violeta will announce along with the upcoming lineup after the conversation. The Q&A will be monitored, so please feel free to drop your questions, but you can also utilize the chat. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guest today. Emily Raboteau is an award-winning writer and professor of creative writing at the City College of New York. Her books, The Professor's Daughter and Searching for Zion, explore the themes such as race and family bonds, and are both winners of the American Book Award. Her next book, Lessons for Survival, is forthcoming from Holt. She is the author of the essay Climate Science, along with many other essays and fiction published in Best American Short Stories, Best American Science Writing, Best American Travel Writing, the New York Times, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, and The Guardian, among others. She is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, and she creatively uses writing and photography as means to draw attention to the climate crisis, whether through a visual exploration of New York City as Bird's Murals, where she resides, or by sharing intimate stories about environmental catastrophes happening around the globe in a Twitter thread. The moderator today, Ognyan Kassabov, is a professor of philosophy at Sofia University. He's a member of Collective for Social Interventions. His work has appeared in Al Jazeera, Jacobins, Crisis and Critique. Ognyan has written the book Technique of Nature and translated Goethe on Living Beings. He labors on aesthetic and political philosophy with a special focus on Kant, German idealism, and Marxist thought. I see some familiar names among the attendees. So those of you who came to the last pre-pandemic night of philosophy here in New York might recall his take on animal economy, bees and capital. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk today and conversation. So thank you so much in advance, and over to you, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Milena. And Ognyan, thank you in advance for moderating. I know you've prepared questions for me, and so thank you for doing the labor of familiarizing yourself with my work in order to be able to do that. I also want to thank Violeta Radkova for organizing this event. Really delighted to participate in this year's online Capital Literature Festival on the urgent topic of climate change, even though I'm sorry not to be in Sofia, Bulgaria. For those who are maybe visually impaired, I'll also describe myself. I'm a 45-year-old female starting to get gray hair, which I don't think you can quite see yet because of the way I'm wearing my hair, which is curly. Wearing glasses, and also a blouse that I got in Tepoztlan, Mexico at another literary festival a few years ago before the pandemic. So I've been invited to deliver a brief lecture about our shared responsibility to raise awareness about the scope of the climate crisis and to look for ways to address this issue through artistic expression. Specifically, I'd like to talk to you about what role literary writers can play in the fight against climate change. Since the publication of the 2018 IPCC report, I find myself increasingly writing and reading on this theme, though I was not trained for it. Some writers use their craft to bear witness to an increasingly unlivable world. Others go further, not only addressing the connections between human activities and environmental catastrophe, but also taking action to change it and compelling others to do the same. I'm not an environmental journalist. I was trained as a creative writer. I got my MFA, my Master of Fine Arts in Fiction, from New York University just after the turn of this century. And 9/11 was the crisis of that era. We spoke then as a program of students and faculty, as a community of writers after our campus reopened, about what it meant for our work. How should we write about September 11th? What kind of language should we use or invent? How had it altered our perception when we were still in the midst of the dust? My published works are a work of fiction and a work of creative nonfiction. Both of them touch on the rupture of 9/11 to American identity. But over the last 4 years, I've more or less jettisoned my latest novel to write as creatively as possible long-form essays about the climate emergency, asking myself many of the same questions as when I was just starting out my writing life, but on a much more existential level because the stakes are so much higher. How should I write about it? What kind of language should I use or invent? As a woman of color raising Black children in a low-income community plagued by environmental injustice, as an American citizen, as a professor at a public university in Harlem, as a homeowner, as a consumer, how has my perception and how does my perception need to adjust as I am in the process of waking up? Given the scale of the crisis, I imagine that some of you in the audience, like me, may be feeling a lot of appropriate anxiety and even fear about the future. Today, I'll talk about some calls to action for writers that have mattered to me, and they may matter to some of you too. Then my understanding is that there'll be some time for questions and answers. This is a safe space to air feelings as a community and to talk about books as a community of readers. I also want to say what this talk is not, given the constraints of time. We aren't here to debate global warming, to solve the climate crisis, or to discuss what can be done on an individual basis, apart from the important action of creative writing. Nor do I presume to dictate what anyone else should or should not be writing. That said, I'd like to refer to a call to writers made by moral philosopher and environmental activist Kathleen Dean Moore. She wrote back in 2013, as the true fury of global warming begins to kick in, forest fires, forests flash to ashes, storms tear away coastal villages, cities swelter in record-breaking heat, drought singes the Southwest, the Arctic melts. We come face to face with the full meaning of the environmental emergency. If climate change continues unchecked, scientists tell us, the world's life support systems will be irretrievably damaged by the time our children reach adulthood. The need for action is urgent and unprecedented. Kathleen Dean Moore then issued a call to writers who have been given the gift of powerful voices that can change the world, in her words. For the sake of all the plants and animals on the planet, for the sake of intergenerational justice, for the sake of the children, we call on writers to set aside their ordinary work and step up to do the work of the moment, which is to stop the reckless and profligate fossil fuel economy that is causing climate chaos. That work may be outside the academy, in the streets, in the halls of politics and power, in the new streets of theaters, of creative disruption, all aimed at stopping industry from continuing to make huge profits by bringing down the systems that sustain life on Earth. These activist efforts need the voices of writers, the genius of thought leaders, the power of words and story. But there is essential work to be done also in our roles as academics and writers, empowered by creative imagination, moral clarity, and the strength of true witness. Write as if your reader were dying, Annie Dillard advised. What would you say to a dying person that would not enrage by its triviality? Now we must write as if the planet were dying. What would you say to a planet in a spasm of extinction? What would you say to those who are paying the costs of climate change in the currency of death? Surely, in a world dangerously slipping away, we need courageously and honestly to ask again the questions every author asks. Who is my audience now, today, in this world? What is my purpose? Some kinds of writing are morally impossible in a state of emergency. Anything written solely for tenure, anything written solely for promotion, any solipsistic project, anything, in short, that isn't the most significant use of a writer's life and talents. Otherwise, how could it ever be forgiven by the ones who follow us, who will expect us finally to have escaped the narrow self-interest of our economy and our age? Some kinds of writing will be essential. More invited creative thought about new or renewed forms our writing can take. She even listed some of these. Number one, the drumhead pamphlet. Like Thomas Paine writing on the head of a Revolutionary War drum, lay it out. Lay out the reasons why extractive cultures must change their ways. Lay out the reasons that inspire the activists. Lay out the reasons that shame the politicians. Lay out the reasons that are a template for decision makers. Number two, the broken-hearted hallelujah. Like Leonard Cohen singing of loss and love, make clear the beauty of what we stand to lose or what we have already destroyed. Celebrate the microscopic sea angels. Celebrate the children who live in the cold doorways and shanty camps. Celebrate the swamp at the end of the road. Leave no doubt of the magnitude of their value and the enormity of the crime to let them pass away unnoticed. These are elegies. These are praise songs. These are love stories. Number three, the witness. Like Cassandra howling at the gates of Troy, bear witness to what you know to be true. Tell the truths that have been bent by skilled advertising. Tell the truths that have been concealed by adroit regulations. Tell the truths that have been denied by fear or complacency. Go to the tar fields, go to the broken pipelines. Tell that story. Be the noisy gong and clanging cymbals, and be the love. Number four, the narrative of the moral imagination. With stories and novels and poems, take the reader inside the minds and hearts of those who live the consequences of global warming. Who are they? Who are we? How do they live? How do we live? What consoles them? What consoles us? Powerful stories teach empathy, build the power to imagine oneself and into another's place, to feel others' sorrow, and so take readers outside the self-absorption that allows the destruction to continue. Number five, the radical imaginary. Reimagine the world, push out the boundaries of the human imagination, too long hogtied by mass media, to create the open space where new ideas can flourish. Maybe it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, or fossil fuels, or terminal selfishness. But this is the work that calls us to imagine new life ways into existence. Writers may not be able to save the old world, but they can help create the new one. Number six, the indictment. Like Jefferson listing the repeated injuries and usurpations, let facts be submitted to a candid world. This is the literature of outrage. How did we come to embrace an economic system that could wreck the world? What iniquity allows it to continue? And number seven, the Apologia. Finally, write this, write to the future. Try to explain how we could allow the devastation of the world, how we could leave those who follow us only in impoverished, stripped, and dangerously unstable time. Ask their forgiveness. This is the literature of prayer. Is it possible to write on your knees, weeping? These were the approaches that Moore imagined. Environmental writer Robert McFarlane, author most recently of Underland, has also written about possible literary approaches for the urgent subject of the climate crisis. Force yourself to see more flatly, orders Georges Perec in Species of Spaces. Force yourself to see more deeply, McFarlane seems to counter. Our flat perspectives feel increasingly inadequate to the deep worlds we now fashion and inhabit, and to the deep time legacies we are leaving. Deep time is the phrase coined by John McPhee in 1981 to denote the dizzying expanses of Earth history that stretch in all directions from the present moment. It echoes John Playfair's description of the abyss of time he glimpsed while viewing a strata unconformity at Sychar Point in 1788, when geology was first emerging as a science. McPhee and Playfair's phrases both evoke a temporal vertigo. Deep time is measured in units that humble the human instant, millennia, epochs, and eons, instead of minutes, months, and years. Deep time is kept by rock, ice, stalactites, seabed sediments, and the drift of tectonic plates. Seen in deep time, things come alive that seemed inert. New responsibilities declare themselves. Ice breathes, rock has tides, mountains rise and fall. We live on a restless earth. There is a perilous comfort to be drawn from deep time. An ethical lotus eating beckons. What does human behavior matter when Homo sapiens will have disappeared from Earth in the blink of a geological eye? Viewed from the perspective of deserts or oceans, morality looks absurd, crushed into irrelevance. A flat ontology entices. All life is equally insignificant in the face of eventual ruin. We should resist such inertial thinking. McFarlane urges us instead. We should urge its opposite, deep time as a radical perspective, provoking action, not apathy. The shock of the Anthropocene requires a new time literacy, a rethinking of what the geologist Marcia Bjornerud calls our place in time. This is already happening. Deep time is the catalyzing context of intergenerational justice. It is what frames the inspiring activism of Greta Thunberg and the school climate strikers and the sunrise campaigners pushing for a Green New Deal. A deep time perspective requires us to consider not only how we will imagine the future, but how the future will imagine us. It asks a version of Jonas Salk's arresting question: are we being good ancestors? Rebecca Altman, an environmental sociologist, has memorably tracked the modern history of time bombing, the toxic legacies that are left by one generation for its successors, of which high-level nuclear waste is the most obvious example. Time bombing is already occurring laterally, of course. William Gibson famously remarked that, quote, "the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed," end quote. In today's Anthropocene, the affluent experience the future in the form of technology, while the poor experience the future in the form of calamity. At its best, deep time thinking contests the eschatologies of fundamentalism and the chaotic short-termism of so much present politics, foregrounding instead the rights of what Rebecca Solnit, writing of the climate strikers, calls the ghostly billions not yet born. In our crisis epic, it recognizes that the continued survival of our species and others depends on such a stretched perspective, rather than the crash-ended narrative arcs of disaster capitalism or fetishized apocalypse dreams that foreclose action in preference for spectacle. Epics and periods are mixing and entangling. Our burning of the liquefied remains of Carboniferous forests melts glacial ice that fell as snow in the Pleistocene, raising sea levels for a future Anthropocene. Both time and place are undergoing what novelist Amitav Ghosh has called the Great Derangement, torqued into new forms by the scales and speeds of anthropogenic change at a planetary level. In his book, The Great Derangement, Amitav Ghosh identifies three of the main challenges posed by the Anthropocene to literature and culture. How to represent unfoldings of action and consequence within deep time. How to recognize the aliveness of the more than human world. And how to come to terms with the profound decentering of human presence. Ghosh is especially interested in the realist novel's adequacies in these respects, and he finds the form not only to have been rendered obsolete by circumstance, but complicitly to have engaged in what he calls the concealment of environmental breakdown. However, he writes hopefully, new hybrid forms will emerge, and the act of reading itself will change once again, as it has many times before. Such hybridity has long been at work in science fiction, of course. Now it is happening in nonfiction too. New online magazines such as Emergence are redefining what an Anthropocene essay might look like and how it might be read. Experimental climate change reportage such as Elizabeth Rush's book Rising, major environmental histories such as Floating Coast, Bathsheba DeMuth's study of the Bering Strait, Laurette Savoy's brilliant account in her book Trace of deep time, race, and the American landscape. All are recognizing the polytemporal weaves of culpability, vulnerability, elementality, and urgency that characterize the present situation. Cli-fi, or climate fiction, is a growing body of literature also directly confronting the climate crisis. What once was the purview of hard-hitting journalistic nonfiction is now the shared backdrop of both literary storytelling and speculative fiction. Authors like Maya Lund in her Climate Quartet and Tochi Onyebuchi in his novel Goliath are inventively finding ways to depict the glaring truth that the climate crisis, for far too long dangerously sidelined within cultural discourse, erroneously perceived as at once too abstract and too immense to bring into human narrative, is a cataclysmic humanitarian crisis. When readers turn to the art and literature of our time, Ghosh writes, imagining a future reader gazing back at the cultures of the Anthropocene, will they not look first and most urgently for traces and portents of the altered world of their inheritance? My wish has been to answer Ghosh's call for writing that might actively unconceal the traces of our fast altering world, and also Moore's call for the radical imaginary, the broken-hearted hallelujah, the witness, the narrative of the moral imagination, the apologia, or a combination of the above, resulting in the thing that would not enrage my grandchildren by its triviality. My hope is to find a hybrid nonfiction form that might, by speaking of deep time, science, environmental justice, American history, global history, personal reflection, geography, architecture, urban sustainability, sea level rise, love, parenthood, New York City, regret, and hope, be at once ancient and urgent. While writing about climate, I have felt a sense of connection and purpose I personally had not felt as a writer of fiction. An acknowledgement, an accounting of time and space running out, of being in the grip of earth forces triggered by human actions, but exceeding human control, of telling the truth, of feeling despair, and writing against and through that feeling. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. This was such a moving finale, writing through, but also against despair. I actually wanted to say that somehow it's obviously a pity that we're not holding this in person, but also as in a way that there is something good that this is a long distance event, in the sense that no flights were booked, and in a situation when COVID, unfortunately, we're also mentioning that topic. COVID is also rising in various places of the world, there is much less traffic going on. But so I wanted to ask you about this latest piece that The Nation published by you, which is actually a reflection back to your early 2020 impressions and the different voices that we hear from your early 2020 diary. So it's actually frustratingly somehow frustrating how contemporary that sounds, like 2 years on. Like we're not even clear when this is going to end. So I wanted to ask you the question that you actually ask elsewhere. How is it possible to be haunted by the future? I found this is a fascinating question that you just like pose in another essay. And how is it possible to be haunted by the future? And how is it possible to not only be haunted, but actually turn that feeling into a productive effect? Because that's what your work is all about, not only expressing a certain sort of atmosphere, a certain sort of emergency, but also inciting to action.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, how is it possible to be haunted by the future? I think as a writer, I'm figuring this out by just paying really close attention to the present, to the anxiety of the present. Because I think, there's this term, climate silence. Evidently, at least in the United States, there is a wide gap between the number of people who have, appropriate anxiety or even belief in climate change and the amount of people who talk about it, like who express feeling. So there's a very wide gap. I'm not sure what the statistic is, but the term for that gap between awareness, belief, and speech is too big. And so some climate scientists believe we need to really close that gap in order to move policy, because if politicians don't understand what their constituents' concerns are, fears are, they're not going to feel motivated to act appropriately upon them. So I had read about this problem of, or the need for closing this gap. And the essay that you referred to, Climate Diary I Kept in the Year 2020, was basically a New Year's resolution I had for myself to try to provoke conversation by asking people, like in my network, in my social network online, but also in life, in the real world, how are you feeling the effects of climate change in your body and in your spirit, in your local habitat? And I was afraid that asking that question would be, like spoiling dinner parties, like I would be the person in the room that nobody wanted to talk to. But in fact, I found the opposite, that people were so already talking about it, or so in need of a space to be able to talk about it, that cataloging their anxieties in this diary form over the course of a year, and then spilling over into the year, that was the year 2019. It spilled over into the year 2020, and then was kind of that project was aborted by the global pandemic outbreak, because suddenly I was just in my nuclear family in my little apartment space and unable to have those kinds of conversations in that way anymore. But to your question, how is it possible to be haunted by the future? Undertaking that project of just cataloging the voices of the present, it felt like paying attention to those anxieties was having also a conversation with the future, along the lines of what Amitav Ghosh is talking about. Like, if you're thinking about future readers, say, or even just future, your own grandchildren, And the ways that they're aware of what we were talking about or weren't talking about or were acting on or weren't acting on, if you're able to even just have a modicum of an understanding of the Iroquois edict, which is like to think 7 generations ahead, not just 1, but 7. Like each action should be predicated on a consciousness of the 7th generation. That's not a practice, unfortunately, most of us were raised in, right? But when one begins to be keenly attuned to the anxieties of the present, of people expressing a waking up to crisis, it can feel like the beginning of a conversation with the future. What do I mean by that exactly? I think it's what Gosh says, like, how do we not, and what Annie Dillard says, how do we not trivialize the experience of the dying, like to consider the experience of the future and those who have inherited terrible crisis. And by the way, speaking of it as a future eventuality is also, there's something wrong with that, right? Like we're so connected to the future in that we are creating it, right? We're in time. I think in answer to your question, this kind of writing, at least for me, is beginning to make me understand myself as a character, if that's the right term, as a human, as an individual in deeper time, connected both to the past and the future. How do we be haunted by the future? I think it's by just considering future generations, actually really thinking about that with some degree of love and concern. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see your point, because like being haunted oftentimes refers to some sort of nostalgia, but like right now we have to definitely think about the future. And actually, I had a quick question in mind that you like very clearly answered even before me asking. It was, are we talking about climate change or climate crisis or climate emergency? It was obviously that climate change is somehow a euphemism in the context that we're living in. But we're already having a question that's actually quite relevant to what we're just discussing. Just before that, I realized that once more I forgot to present myself. So I'm Ognyan, as Milena said, a male wearing glasses too, with a simple red, yellow, and blue shirt. And yeah, I'm based right now in Sofia, Bulgaria, which is the host city of this literature festival. And we're having a question from Colin Nenov, who's asking about the imagination, about the radical imaginaries. So which radical imaginaries and which of their works in specific have impressed you the most? That's Colin's question.
Oh, good. So I had the benefit very recently of serving as moderator, like kind of like what Ognyan is doing for me. In this event, I was the moderator with 3 writers. This was the Pan America Festival. And they all were gathered together because they had written what we might call climate fiction, like fiction that takes into consideration the climate emergency in ways that Amitav Ghosh is saying not enough writers are doing. And so one of those writers whose work I was not familiar with yet was Maja Lunde, who I mentioned, a Norwegian author who's writing a climate quartet. The 3rd book has just come out, translated into, or at least come out in the United States. That's called The Last Horses, and the last book in her quartet will be coming out, I think, in Europe in the fall, and maybe a little bit later in the United States. But I was so impressed by Maja's project because, she insisted that she's writing is not climate fiction. She's writing literature, right? And the fact that she doesn't almost want it to be like tagged that way, cli-fi or climate fiction, because it's so steeply a part of her own consciousness and conversation and awareness at this point as a writer in terms of the plot that she's creating. That she's figured out, she understands now in each of these books that there need to be like 3 timelines, past, present, future. She does that consistently. And with the 3rd book, Last Horses, you have a timeline where like these horses are dying out. They're somebody preserves one of these horses from Mongolia, somewhere in Europe, like, and then is trying to make sure that this thing doesn't die. Then you have a present timeline where the horses, like, they've been brought back, right, into like a thriving species. And then you have the future timeline where there's only one horse left again. And that's because of species extinction is like affecting this horse too. And so you have this weaving of time, like an awareness Maya has of deep time, where you get to see like human action interacting with this other species, like bringing it almost to death, bringing it back again through like genetic science, and then almost killing it off again. And because of this sense of time, she has created a feeling of real, not only urgency, but also sadness. Like some of those terms I was talking about in my lecture that Kathleen D. Moore uses, like, this is an apologia, this is an active witness, like, an active radical imaginary. Like, she's doing all of that in her books. And I was just so impressed by the largesse of her project, because it's not 3 timelines in one book merely, it's 4 books. Like, she's doing an enormous amount of research and decentering human experience also, you know. Another book that's gotten a lot of attention is that book by Richard Powers about the trees. Is his book called The Understory? The Understory by Richard Powers. Beautiful story that's about the life of trees, considering the lifetimes that they inhabit, the ways that they communicate, then decentering humans as the only players in the plot was something that was very radical, and he received the Pulitzer Prize for that book, I believe, because it wasn't something that we'd quite seen done before. You know, like, wow, you can write a novel about trees that's actually incredibly emotionally gripping and dramatically inventive. Those are a couple of works that come to mind when I think of radical imaginary, right? Like, and I mean that when I say, like, creatively, this is a topic you can think of no more topic than this, I think, is as hard to grapple with or look at or confront. And at the same time, creatively speaking, there's so many opportunities to be radically inventive on the page with how we address it, how we try to describe it, how we try to, show what's going on.
Well, actually, I was really impressed by Maya Lunde's previous book about the bees. Because Milena said I was dabbling in this bee crisis and trying to make sense of how we've actually turned the bee into a role model of like hard work, like as a symbol, so to speak. And at the same time, we're basically abusing those animals to a very harsh ecological detriment. But what struck me in that book, and that book, you remember, it also has those 3 interweaving, at least 3, as far as I can gather, storylines. One is in the 19th century, one in our days, and one in the future. It was, in a way, on the one hand, it was, and I don't mean that as a criticism, but it was very bleak and dystopian, especially the third story, which is like in the future, and also the political side to it was maybe not missing, but it was downplayed. Maybe that's a good thing, actually, because you don't want your fiction author to be preaching from her page, but still, from what I gather from your essays, there is you do realize there is a very strong political, in the most general sense, dimension to the whole thing. There is this question about first, as you just said in your lecture, how have we come to accept such and such a system of greed, profit, and so on and so forth, such an extractive economy, and also such an unequal economy also. And also the other question for the radical imaginary would be how to imagine a future. So how would you say this question might be a bit more abstract, but still like this interrelation between politics, literature, and maybe also activism. So maybe start from there. Do you consider yourself as a writer to be an activist? So, or are those two different roles? And also, what's the place of a larger, maybe political project or vision within fiction/nonfiction?
Yeah.
Relating to the climate crisis.
Yeah. It points to another question, which is like, does climate fiction or literature about climate actually move the needle on the problem at all? Like, that's
a very central one. Yeah.
Yeah. Can it have that underlying power? I don't know. Maybe the jury is still out on that question, whether or not. I mean, I have to believe, right, that as a reader and a writer who's been profoundly impacted by things that I've read, I have to believe like that. I want to believe that the things that we can write can impact change. Now, practically speaking, what does that mean? Practically speaking, I think it also gets to this problem, right? It's Katherine Hayhoe, by the way, is the scientist who specifically says one of the most important things we can do to combat the climate crisis is talk about it. And that is because if we're not talking about it, politicians aren't acting on it, right? So I also feel that creative writing is a kind of speech, right? It's a communication. And it's a different kind of communication than what scientists are able to do, in part because they have almost like a rein on their tongue. They can't speak from the imagination, they speak from the world of facts. So I encountered, and I put this, I think, in the last part of that diary you referred to that they published in The Nation a couple of weeks ago, an altercation between a journalist who was leaving journalism because it was, she felt like she was being forced to be too equal, like she had to be too balanced with like this perspective and that perspective when writing about the climate crisis. She didn't feel that she should be writing in any sort of balanced way at all. She didn't feel that the quotes that she's giving from oil executives should be treated as with any kind of equivalency to a 17-year-old climate activist who's not going to school on Fridays anymore because they're not teaching them about what matters the most. And so she was confronting a climate scientist who's often invited to speak on television about hurricanes. And she said, why aren't you more stark when you have this privileged position to be on the news? Why aren't you more stark in saying, when you're asked this question, as you often are, like, can you attribute this hurricane to climate change? And he can't say that. He's not allowed, he doesn't feel he's allowed to say that because, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah,
right?
There's no direct causal relationship.
Right. Yes, he can't say that. Scientifically, he can't. And she said to him, why can't you also speak as a citizen, also speak as a father? Why can't you say, when you're invited on the news in this privileged position, why can't you say, as a scientist, I can tell you this. As a father, I can tell you I'm scared out of my mind, right? As a citizen, I can tell you, and speak also from the heart. Well, he doesn't feel he has that liberty or that privilege, but the creative writer does, right? So I think there's a different kind of power. And this is what Kathleen Dean Moore was acknowledging too. Like, there's a different kind of imaginative power that I have to believe can also move the needle and move hearts and minds like into actual political will and action. Even in terms of like being a convincing storyteller. I was talking with a man yesterday, for example, he said, like, I don't know if I'm a climate denier. He's kind of a climate denier. Like, he does, he's like, the climate has always been changing kind of guy. isn't the climate always been changing? And he said, like, if you cut down a redwood tree, like these old growth trees from California, if you cut one down, can't you see in the rings that the climate has always been changing? And I realized, like, talking to this man, well, he just hasn't really had the story told to him in a way that's like effective or convincing yet, you know, or he's hearing his story. The narratives that he's getting or the news that he's watching is telling him a different kind of story, perhaps, than the news that I'm being fed or the news that I'm watching. And so that was an opportunity, actually, as a storyteller, to say, to invite or to begin a conversation, right? Not to convince him that climate change exists, but to say, like, yes, the climate has always changed, and yet it's changing a lot faster and a lot more drastically in a much more dangerous way more recently because of these things. And I think, you know, what I'm trying to say is that storytelling has a kind of a power. Imaginative storytelling has a kind of a power. For me personally, fiction doesn't feel like the right place for this subject. Maybe for some of the reasons you were gesturing at in regards to the history of bees, although I did find it very like powerful image when you have humans pollinating the flowers, because like they're doing it by hand because the bees aren't doing it anymore and it needs to be done. And I just found that image alone like so sad and so stark. But then, you know, when we're talking again about radical imaginary and perhaps like ghosts or the being haunted by the future, there's other writers who have, you know, who are less apocalyptic about it. Typically, I think when we think of future scenarios, increasingly even present scenarios, people are reaching for like apocalyptic narratives. But then sometimes you have people like Eric Holthaus. He's a meteorologist, and he wrote an interesting book that grew out of an interesting essay where he writes from the future, from the perspective of a future and a not terribly distant future, like 30 years out, but where it's gone right. He had like the boldness to imagine everything going well, like everybody getting on board with actually coming together to try to solve the problem. And I really liked his experiment because instead of extrapolating like worst case scenarios, he had the audacity to actually imagine a more beautiful future, like a more just future. And I think that was an important intervention in this sort of writing universe, of the conversation that's happening in literature around future scenarios and our relationship to the future, because it was one I had never seen before. Like, okay, this is a letter to us from the future that he's imagining that's better than now. That was crazy to me. And it even seemed a little Pollyanna-ish, but yet so necessary in the pantheon of things that are being imagined and written.
Right. No. All right. There is something. Well, you just mentioned another person that you talked to while reading your writing, even before your climate prose. What struck me is that a lot of your prose seems to me letting other voices be heard. You talk to people and you just like let them speak. It's both in your COVID diaries and in like searching for Zion. You meet people and you tell their stories, which I think is what a great storyteller should do anyway. But so there is and in a way that's a great way to build community. You talked about that in your small lecture just a bit before, but when we're talking about climate crisis, building community is very important because we need, so to speak, we're always using this, and this fascinates me. This word "we." We need to do something, but who is this "we"? Because you mentioned several times, and it's like obvious that there is such things as climate injustice, climate inequality. Different authors also are able to address different types of audiences. Whereas we have here a very global problem, but we also have to constitute a viable we in order to be able to act. And also another part is that this whole thing is a certain sort of polemic, not only against maybe our apathy, but also against some sort of, as you mentioned, greed, some sort of economic system. So there are the bad guys, so to speak. So there's the question about the we, and there's the question, whom are we opposing in a way? Whom are we combating? We're not going to fight against the climate, right? We're not going to fight against humans as a species. I mean, all this talk about the Anthropocene. It's not that humans came and just ruined the planet. That there's a certain economic system going on. I mean, you mentioned in a lot of your writings those hurricanes, Sandy, and before that Katrina, but like the notion of disaster capitalism, Naomi Klein, it has to do with the way U.S. authorities and corporations dealt with that disaster. So that was a biggie, I guess, and that was a biggie. So maybe if you can answer it by way of some like strong slogans, because we have more questions in the Q&A. But still, how do we build this we? And whom are we polemicizing against?
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna answer the biggie in a way. I'll respond, and I'll incorporate one of the questions that I like that Christopher Winks has posed also in the chat. So one of my favorite writers is Teju Cole, who used to be very active on Twitter and is no longer active on Twitter. But his tag, what do you call his what it says under his name in Twitter is we who, which I love because it's 2 words and it's so simple, but a really important question. Who do we even mean when we say we? The question of, we have to be very careful when we say we, because there can be a lot of inappropriate assumptions when we think we're speaking for others, right? Okay, so as for, and yet also it's an important, I think, to be increasingly global in our thinking about we, or who might be included in we, is really crucial in this conversation. For myself, when I did this project of the climate diary in 2019, what I began to notice by privileging to the best of my ability voices, as broadly speaking from around the world as possible, from different classes, but different geographic locations. I really didn't want it to be New York centered or United States centered, but to try to gather voices from around the world to the best of my ability. Now, I'm lucky enough that I live in a global city and I teach at a public university where most of my students come from other countries, are, in most cases, first generation immigrant. And so a lot of those voices were from them. And some of those voices were from people that I'd met doing things like this conference in another country, right? So what I learned, when I hear my friend in the Bay Area, in Marin County, from in a very, very wealthy part of California, who's terrified about forest fires, and she's using the same language as a woman that I met in Lebanon to describe more or less the same phenomenon, right? And the same language as a friend in Sydney, Australia, who's talking about, air quality and the breath of her children, the ability of her children to breathe, and the need probably to actually migrate, with great urgency and fear. It began to make me understand that word "we" in a much bigger way, because they're using the same words. Even though they have different mother tongues, they're using the same words to speak about their fear of fire. As for who we are standing against, right? The profligate enemy. This woman I mentioned who had the altercation, the journalist who was leaving journalism, who was having an altercation with the weatherman, who's always on the news, not using gripping enough terms, who won't use a term like like climate crisis or climate emergency because he fears a government authoritarian rule. She is named Emily Atkins, and she has a blog that I highly recommend called Heated, which is like now where she puts all of her writing that doesn't have to be unbiased because she's no longer writing for a newspaper. She's just an independent journalist now. She is a person who's very clear about the enemy. Like her plot is all about, okay, we need to fight against the fossil fuel industry and to a degree, like the capitalist structure that supports it again and again and again. And she finds that narrative to be very powerful for herself as a writer. Like we have an enemy, we have a fight, we have a kind of story to tell that is about winning that fight. We have a Goliath, right? There is a lot of writing that I think is powerful that works that way. Now, what Christopher Winks has written here in the chat, I also wanted to just read. I don't know if everyone has access to this, but it says here, Indigenous people worldwide are at the forefront of struggles against climate disaster. Beyond fiction, shouldn't these voices be accorded more prominence in the literary world? Secondly, poetry has always addressed ecological devastation more so than fiction. In the English-speaking world, I think of Jean Clare, Wordsworth, Blake, and of poetry of the Caribbean in many languages. Might the problem that Gauche addresses be somehow intrinsic to the way the bourgeois form of the novel has imposed itself as the primary literary genre? Yes, I think so. And this is why, yes, I think Indigenous narratives, increasingly, I think people are waking up to the fact that we need Indigenous knowledge and survival, thinking about survival and deep time in different ways, and decentering human experience, like turning to the wisdom from Indigenous populations, also trying to do that in ways that aren't extractive or disrespectful is crucial. But yes, I've been thinking about this too, Christopher, that somehow I can only speak for myself as a writer, but I'm finding new forms or hybrid forms or more experimental forms that make us rethink, decenter the I and think about we in a much bigger, more capacious way that even includes in ways I'm only beginning to awaken to plant life, right? Not just humans, but plant life, animal species as being sentient beings that are part of our world and our narrative and the fabric of our existence. It seems to me that it doesn't mean the novel is an incorrect container for the possibilities of the kind of radical imaginative narratives that we hope might help move the needle on this problem. But perhaps that novel needs to look very different from, it might look very different from the kinds of novels we're used to or have seen, or the kind of writing, it might look more like poetry. When I think about how Teju Cole wrote We Who, challenging the idea of what we think we understand we to be, or what it might possibly come to mean. I like to think of the novel in the same way. Novel what? Like We Who, novel what? What might it be? Like, why did we love that thing that it was? Who are the people who have pushed the boundaries of what it is? I think of Don Quixote. That's a crazy book. Moby Dick, like those are novels, but they're also something else. And these writers who inspire me with these kinds of calls that I gestured at in my lecture, Amitav Ghosh, Kathleen D. Moore, I think are they're throwing down a gauntlet. Like, what can we do with writing? What can we do with the novel? How can we be more inventive, more loving, more experimental, more radical? I think it's an exciting time to be working in this medium on this subject. And poetry, you're right, Christopher, I think has always been a place, because it's more akin to prayer, maybe because it's more attached to spirit, like it's a distilled kind of truth. And maybe we're more flabby in the novel than in poetry, even in terms of speaking of word count. I know we're coming close to the end of time, but I wonder if there's any final questions or comments.
There is one more kind of more not so much relating about ideas, but about technique. So there's an anonymous question about what creative writing techniques do you believe are most effective when it comes to communicating those ideas?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot.
Yeah.
As a writer and also as a teacher of creative writing, I've increasingly feeling like technique, like increasingly understanding that structure is everything. Like deciding on a structure, the container that will give your reader a sense of the authority of your narrative voice and project. If the reader understands the structure, then the thing can be as wild as possible, right? As long as there's some kind of operating structure. And I think about math a lot, more mathematically than ever before, increasingly with this subject. Like the equation needs to be evident to the reader in order to earn movement in time, deep experimentation, radical ideas, the inclusion of facts in a way that isn't boring. Like, for example, I wrote an essay called Climate Science that I think Milena referred to when she introduced me. And I wrote it because I live in New York City and there were these weird climate signs at Public Art Project appearing in the 5 boroughs. And they were meant by the artists to like provoke conversation and thought and exploration about how the climate crisis is affecting New York City. But most people were just walking them by and not noticing them. And I made just a decision. I'm going to take the artist up. The artist, this is an act of love. Like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go all around New York City. I'm going to go to every climate sign. I'm going to look at it. And not only that, but I'm going to try to understand on a deep level how climate change is affecting like the area that sign has been placed in, on a scientific level, on a social level, on an environmental level, on a political level. What is the threat that this artist is trying to call our attention to? And I understood that the structure needed to be very clear. Well, there were 10 signs. This was going to be an essay with 10 parts. And I was going to go to each of those sites and do a deep dive on that site that also allowed me to go back in time and that I could basically go anywhere in each of those sections. A reader would go anywhere with me as long as they understood this is an operating structure of 10. This author is the Virgil, right? On this experimental journey through the purgatory that we're in. And I trust her because she's told me where we're going to go and what we're going to do. And I don't know entirely what I'm going to see, but I know that this journey is going to be like 10 places we're going to visit. So as far as technique goes, I think like being very clear with your reader about structure allows for great experimentation and lassitude of genre even. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that's what my students never believe. I always tell them structure. So we don't have time. I was hoping you were going to share some insights about your upcoming book, Lessons for Survival, but the word goes to Violetta.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt this very touching discussion. It touches me, especially when Emily, you refer to poetry and what an effective vessel it is to communicate these ideas, because it is indeed akin to prayer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One last thing, because you said this, Walter Brueggemann, theologian, says poetry, it has that power of prayer because it cuts across the language of the state. It's antithetical to, like it's opposite the language of the state. That's also why we respond to it in a different way, like from the heart. and the language of policy or whatever it is that we understand is like word salad. So thank you for having me. Thank you for this festival.
Thank you. Thank you for joining Capital Literature 2022, which is the International Literary Festival held in Sofia, Bulgaria since 2009 and organized by the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation for Creative Writing. I'm Violeta, director of the foundation, and I would like to thank also Sofia Municipality and the National Fund for Culture for supporting our program. We are looking forward to our next public events. 2 virtual talks are coming up in July. Houston-based professor, curator, activist, and author Lacey M. Johnson will be discussing climate writing on July 13th, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 6 p.m. Sofia time, and poet Amy Nuzukumotaril, author of the New York Times best-selling illustrated collection of nature essays and Kirkus Prize finalist World of Wonders, will be joining us on July 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which is 8 p.m. Sofia time. So if you would like to know more about what's coming next, please head out to our social media outlets. And I thank Emily and Ognyan for the discussion today. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.